the Eastern tradition is not burdened with certain misreadings of Paul, which produced notions of grace in nature and of nature and supernature that make universalism a more difficult position to occupy. Plus, there are not certain notable mistranslations regarding, say, the inheritance of sin and things like that. So what I would say is that in Eastern tradition, it's easier to get to the universalist view, and it's not surprising that the majority of the Universalist fathers were Eastern rather than Western, I suppose. It's certainly the case that at various times, say 19th century and 20th century Russia, Universalism seems to have been the dominant tendency among the very educated theologians and religious philosophers. The other Eastern churches, I mean, the East Syrian church, often and incorrectly called Nestorian, very deep streams of universalism, which are just explicit well into the late Middle Ages and after. And even the liturgy of the Syrian church seems pretty explicitly universalist. But on the whole, I mean, I think the whole of Christian tradition, and certainly the whole of imperial Christendom's Christianity, still came officially to proclaim eternal torment as the good news, or as part of it. So you can't really be too sanctimonious about these things with regard to the West. I just think that in the West, things got far, far worse. I mean, as soon as one begins to think in terms of predestination in the way the late Augustine did, again, it's not only a mistranslation, but it requires a fairly obvious violence to the text, for instance. I mean, Augustine spends a good deal of time explaining why in Romans 8, when Paul says that those whom God foreknew, he marked out in advance, he really means the other thing. He means to say just the opposite. He marked some out in advance. But again, once predestination becomes willy-nilly predestinatio duplex, moreover, because the notion that there's a difference between saying that God predestines only the elect to salvation but doesn't predestine the rest to damnation just is a meaningless distinction at the end of the day. But by the time you reach Calvin and the language of predestination, and not just Calvin, it's true of the Catholic world as well, Jansen, Jansenius, the predestination is evidence of the one divine attribute that anyone is still willing to affirm without qualification, which is absolute divine sovereignty. Then you're in a position of basically such moral nihilism that universalism is not only not possible, it's based on a vision of God that has nothing to do with what has become the theologically dominant picture. So the East has better resources. It doesn't necessarily have a better history on this matter.